Let's have a nice civil discussion on pedophilia.
I'm going to attempt to be civil in this video. Honestly, this is not my first encounter with someone whose opinions I find less than desirable, but I find that in these instances it is beneficial to be cordial than not to be, for the simple fact that I want people to listen. I need people to listen because this is fucking important. Now, I've made videos about this topic before, but it needs to be addressed again for different reasons from different angles because different arguments have been made. Today, I am responding to Amos Yee's video on why pedophilia is alright.
First, we need to agree on just one thing, that sexual abuse is not determined by age, but instead on whether or not the relationship involves consent.
So when you say consent, are you talking about the just go with the flow even if you don't understand what's happening type of consent, or are you talking about someone who is fully aware, in full comprehension, and who remains unmanipulated by the person asking them to consent? Because there is a difference, Amos, believe it or not. This will become very relevant very soon.
Most people would make the absolute broad generalization that any kid that is below the age of 12 are not able to consent to sex.
Yes, and there is a reason for that. Because more often than not, those children don't necessarily know what it is that they're getting into. You see, your argument is flawed right from the get-go. You assume that the child consenting knows exactly what it is they're getting into, knows the feelings, has experimented enough with themselves to know what they like, what they don't like, in some cases that maybe they've developed enough to the point where it isn't going to cause them internal harm, that they even know what harm can be caused in engaging in such acts. Because all of these things play into the concept of consenting and giving consent. When you are consenting to someone, it is imperative that you do so with full knowledge and awareness of what it is you're consenting to. It is called informed consent. The reason why people use the tail end of estimated puberty as a benchmark for having sex, so like 16, 17, 18 in the States specifically, has a lot to do with the fact that children will have developed into teens with all new reproductive knowledge about themselves to accompany that physical development. In addition to that, their body will have changed to the point where it's ready to have sex. Usually this is 4 years after the start of puberty, between the ages of, like, say, 10 and 14. Add about 4 years onto that and you get 14 to 18, and that is the end of puberty per se in most cases on average. Now we use the tail end of that 14 to 18 estimate because 16 to 18 in the States is usually when we give people more responsibilities, like licenses, they go off to war, they can vote. It's a nice benchmark that's not too early and not too late. Usually kids have their shit pretty much together. They're ready to go off to college, graduate high school, get a job, fend for themselves in some instances on some level. At this point, they are morphing into that next level of becoming an adult. They're not entirely mature, but they have an idea of who it is they are and who they want to be. Not always, because kids are stupid, even when they're 18. But let's get to the interesting part that everyone is so obsessed with. Genitals. Now, everyone is aware that genitals go through a stage of development during this phase of puberty. It's bound to happen. As people go through growth spurts, you'd be a fool to assume that their respective genitals didn't also go through growth spurts. Now, where am I going with this? Men. You'll be happy to know that the average size of a man's penis in a flaccid state is 3.5 inches, and in an erect state, that average size extends to a lengthy of 5.1 inches. Goody for you. Now get ready to pat yourselves on the back because that's more than enough length for the average 3 to 4 inches of depth for a woman's vagina. And it should be noted that I am referencing adult sizes, so we can logically assume that because we know that children are a lot smaller physically, their genitals would also happen to be a lot smaller. The same goes for anuses because I know someone is going to make that argument as well. despite the fact that they do fluctuate in size frequently. Anuses for children are a lot smaller. I do not know the exact measurements, and frankly, I do not care to, because I'm not a child's mother, a child's father, or their pediatrician. I am just stating the simple truth that is, or should have been, obvious. Now, one can logically infer that if a grown man decided to insert himself into that of a child, how likely do you think it would be that it would hurt? That it would even possibly cause some permanent damage? But Weeb, you say, that's not an issue if you're aroused. That takes into account what I was talking about earlier, with children not having enough experience to know what it is they like and don't like enough to get themselves aroused. I'm sure you're aware that it's usually the case that people on their first sexual experiences don't exactly know what they're doing, and usually the first time is less than desirable and hurts. It's not like it's some big firework moment for everybody. That's not the case. You can bet your ass that the same is possibly even more so the case with children. If you need an anecdotal example of this, then here you go. A 13-year-old child bride in Yemen died 4 days after her arranged marriage due to a tear in her genitals and severe internal bleeding. This was March of 2016. So you tell me, Amos. The simple fact of the matter is this, Amos. Children are stupid. They don't know what they want. Or what's good for them, for that matter. Most people will tell you they remember when they were a kid they wanted to be a rock star when they grew up. Eat candy for every meal because it tastes good, and sit at the adult table where they don't understand the conversation, or hell, they never wanted to go to school. Despite the fact that going to school would definitely help with your, future prospects. We don't let kids do whatever the hell they want all willy-nilly like because they don't know what they want. Or they don't understand what it is they're getting into, just like we don't let children consent to sex because of those reasons, Amos. And sure, I will concede with your points. There might be some one person somewhere who claims to be the exception, where they are perfectly fine and dandy after they had sex with an adult, years ago when they were a kid, and now they're fine as an adult. But, Amos, society is not in the business of letting exceptions dictate the rules that they live by.
But then one day, a 42-year-old adult comes along and says that while he was 10 years old, he had a perfectly consensual sexual relationship with a 30-year-old adult.
I will reiterate, as I said, exceptions to the rule do not mean that the rule should be changed or abolished. No, Amos, that's not how society works.
10-year-old him was not traumatized afterwards. The relationship was perfectly fine and consensual, and both of them enjoyed the sexual relationship.
It depends on the state laws, but yes, because that is the law, Amos.
So do you think that that kind of relationship should not happen? That just because the child was below 18, that relationship that was perfectly harmless should be considered child rape? No! That's absolutely ridiculous. Nobody was harmed.
So you were telling me that in this instance, where something illegal has occurred and nobody was harmed, it's okay. Well then, allow me to burn your house down while no one is inside. No one is going to get hurt, so it should be fine, right? What you are attempting to define here, Amos, is a victimless crime. But the thing is, as I've already established, that is not usually the case with such instances.
And this is not a fantasy story that I just pulled out of my ass. There are numerous stories of children below the age of 12 who have had mutually beneficial relationships, sexual relationships, with adults.
You see, here's the thing. If you were actually to read this, it doesn't say anything about adult-on-child interactions, rather that children aged 7 to 8 play sexually erotic games with each other, and that they are often encouraged to do so, often taking up sexual relations in earnest 4 to 5 years later. But it doesn't say anything about whether or not they are with adults. The point is moot.
So if you agree that that kind of relationship should be completely fine and legal, then you should also agree that every relationship between a child and an adult is alright as long as it involves consent.
And the simple fact is, Amos, children cannot give completely cognizant, informed consent to such an act.
Let's continue. Now, I'm absolutely certain that we should not discriminate against pedophiles.
Yes, I agree. No one should be discriminated against no matter what. Everyone has the same rights within the law, though, Amos, in the States. No one is allowed to fuck kids, not just pedophiles. See, I don't trust pedophiles around any children that I may have in the future or anyone else's children for that matter. Kind of like I don't trust a klepto with anything of mine, an arsonist with matches, or a serial killer with a knife. You see how that works?
Our society's treatment of pedophiles is inhumane and horrendous. Oh my gosh.
Now, I will agree, we could be doing more to help the people afflicted with pedophilia. This, in part, because we have conflated the idea of someone being aroused by children entirely with the act of molesting children. These are not mutually exclusive, that is true. They are not mutually exclusive to each other. In fact, not all pedophiles are child molesters, just like not all child molesters are pedophiles. It's important to distinguish because one is a disorder and the other is a crime. It's like if you were to say all alcoholics are drunk drivers. That aside, just because the alcoholics aren't going and doing anything illegal at the time, it doesn't mean that I don't think that they still need help. The same goes for pedos.
A pedophile is simply defined as an individual who has a sexual attraction to children. That's it. It doesn't mean he's going to molest children. It doesn't even mean he's going to act upon his sexual urges. All he has is the non-violent sexual attraction to children.
Essentially, Amos is arguing from the position where his mind has removed the physical act of committing pedophilia from the disorder of pedophilia itself, essentially removing stigma from it in his head entirely.
If you have the desire to rape children, then yeah, that's bad. But most pedophiles, like most people, do not want child abuse. Most pedophiles and people in NAMBLA absolutely condemn rape and child abuse.
Now, I've had conversations with these people, and that might be the case. They are rather vehement about it, insisting that they don't want to hurt children. The trouble is, however, that we understand the concept of child abuse in very different ways. They see it as violence and force and non-consent, while everyone else kind of recognizes the ridiculousness of insisting that children can make these decisions for themselves at such a young age.
Whether you were biologically born with that sexual orientation or you were influenced by your surroundings, if you just have the desire to have a perfectly consensual sexual relationship with a child, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Point in case.
And pedophiles, like the LGBT community, seem to exist in very significant numbers in society.
Now, there are a few things wrong with this study. One, it was conducted with only 80 participants, not nearly enough of a pool to actually substantiate your claims that 1/4 of society's population of males are pedophiles. Furthermore, you'll notice that in the abstract of the study that I actually bothered to read and you didn't, subjects who were highly arousable insofar as they were unable to voluntarily and completely inhibit their sexual arousal were more sexually aroused by all stimuli than were subjects who were able to inhibit their sexual arousal. Thus, arousal to pedophilic stimuli does not necessarily correspond with pedophilic behavior. And this ties into my next point very nicely, Amos, which is when erections occur. Physiological stimulation can trigger an erection. Furthermore, erection can be initiated by auditory, olfactory, imagined, or tactile stimuli, even the slightest bit of stimuli. There are also nocturnal erections which happen during sleep or upon waking up. And finally, there are spontaneous erections. They can happen even if they are unwanted. To insist that every single erection a male gets by any one thing is a telltale sign of that person's orientation, sexual orientation, is kind of ridiculous, Amos. But then there is my fourth point, Amos, which also ties this all into a nice little bow, and that is this. We know full well that some victims of sexual assault actually do become aroused in the midst of the assault, but does arousal necessarily equal consent? No, of course not. It's a reaction akin to when a doctor uses a reflex hammer on your knee. Thus, the point stands that arousal should be taken with a grain of salt, as It tells us less about a person's legitimate state of mind and sexual orientation, and more about their reflexive reaction to stimuli. Granted, we are splitting hairs here, but, I'm allowed to do that, considering.
Why should we immediately discriminate against such a huge group of people, say that they are scum and they should be imprisoned when they have done absolutely nothing wrong?
Agreed, we shouldn't punish for thought crimes. I stand by that principle wholeheartedly, but we sure as hell shouldn't be encouraging certain thoughts, Amos.
There are people who realize that they have a sexual attraction to children, but since society discriminates against pedophiles so much, these people contemplate suicide. There are even stories in the US where adults apply electroshock therapy to boys as young as 12 who think that they have a sexual attraction to children. Like, what the fuck?
It should be noticed that you used a Tumblr blog as your source for this. That little tidbit aside, let's have a look-see at your source. You'll notice here that it says the right picture, similar device to the electroshock therapy one to the left, used in the 1990s and 2000s on men and boys as young as 12, thought to be attracted to children. All devices are manufactured by Pharrell Instruments. Wow, Amos, let's just take that image and do a quick reverse Google image search. Oh, penile plethysmograph. Now, what the fuck is a plethysmograph, you ask? It is a measure of blood flow to the penis, typically used as a proxy for measurement of sexual arousal. The most common reported methods of conducting penile plethysmography involve the measurement of the circumference of the penis with a mercury in rubber or electromechanical strain gauge, or the volume of the penis with an airtight cylinder and an inflatable cuff at the base of the penis. Now, Amos, I might be Polish, but I am certainly not dumb. That does not sound to me like an electroshock therapy instrument in the slightest.
I do not want to live in a society where we condone this kind of discrimination and hostility towards a group of people who have done absolutely nothing wrong. This is vile. This is absolutely horrible.
For sexual offenders, it is typically used to determine the level of sexual arousal. Oh, okay.
If a child and an adult have consensual sex, they both film it, and they both agree that it's fine for the footage to be on the internet, there's absolutely nothing wrong done.
Except that it's illegal. Except that the internet is forever. Except that they're being taken advantage of. Except that they don't necessarily understand the magnitude nor the ramifications of their actions fully. And to let them do something so stupid so early in their life that would haunt them the rest of their life would be irresponsible at the least and sinister at the most. Don't believe me? Have a study. Easy access to CP on P2P networks may increase the harm to victims of child pornography production when they have to live with the knowledge that their images are publicly available and easily accessible to P2P users.
Why should it be illegal? In the US, for producing child porn, an adult gets a minimum of 15 years in prison and a maximum of 30. That is fucking insane!
Usually the kid has been kidnapped, abused, raped, doesn't consent, or isn't even old enough to understand exactly the ramifications of what's going on.
Even worse is most countries criminalize simply possessing child pornography.
I don't think you understand how incredibly insidious the child porn industry is. It's certainly not Pornhub. There's not that much regulation except for what the federal government can do, and even then, it's kind of hard to regulate the internet, and not just separate websites. As I said, the internet is forever. While some child sexual abuse images depict children in great distress and sexual abuse is self-evident, other images may depict children that appear complacent. It is common for producers of child pornography to groom their victims. That's when they manipulate their victims into thinking that this is okie dokie, or cultivate a relationship with the child and gradually sexualize the contact over time. The grooming process fosters a false sense of trust and authority over a child in order to desensitize or break down a child's resistance to sexual abuse. Therefore, even if a child appears complacent in a particular image, it is important to remember that the abuse may have started years before the image was created. And finally, Additionally, many victims of child pornography suffer from feelings of helplessness, fear, humiliation, and lack of control, given that their images are available for others to view in perpetuity. All of my links are in the description if you should like to check them out, Amos, and anyone else watching these.
Possessing child pornography, a completely non-violent act, whether you viewed it based on sexual attraction or non-sexual curiosity, in the US, you get a minimum of 5 years in prison and a maximum of 15.
Because of what I just stated, even if it were a hypothetical case of consent, you don't know that the child was consenting. There is so much child porn out there that, and it's clearly not like the industry is regulating itself. No, it's not harmless. No ifs, ands, or buts about it, Amos.
What the fuck? And even if I gave you the benefit of the doubt and said that, okay, all child sex is rape, and so all child pornography is essentially footage of rape, is it wrong to upload or view footage of child rape? No!
Yes, because, and the DOJ said it beautifully in their report, the children exploited in these images must live with the permanency, longevity, and circulation of such a record of their sexual victimization. This often creates lasting psychological damage to the child, including disruption in sexual development, self-image, and developing trust relationships with others in the future. You sick fuck.
Now, people might argue that the reason why footage of child porn or child rape should be banned is because having it on the internet would promote such behavior.
No, not even close. It's because you're perpetuating the victimization of someone's daughter, someone's son. A human being has been made the victim of, and you want that on the internet for all to see? You think it's okay?
However, the fact is, there really is no evidence that there's a link between watching violent footage and an increase in violent crimes, and if there is, please show it to me. It's kind of like the people who say that having the death penalty helps reduce crime, or banning violent movies helps reduce violence. Like, it seems like there would be a logical connection, but the fact is, there's absolutely no evidence to show that there is a connection.
It's not about the connection.
Uploading and watching footage of real violence should not be illegal, similar to how you should not be sent to prison if you see footage of a reporter getting beheaded by a Muslim.
Immortalizing someone's absolute lowest point in life for the world to see against their will or their understanding even is utterly despicable. And if you had even a shred of empathy for another person, you would see that, Amos.
It doesn't mean you want to conduct violence when you watch footage of real violence. It just means that you might have a curiosity at how horrible human beings can be. Bottom line, producing and uploading footage of child porn should be absolutely fine and legal. If you want to upload and possess footage of child rape, that should be fine too. Punish the guy who actually raped the kid. Many people are willing to reduce the age of consent to whatever subjective opinion they have on how much brain development a child should have before they are capable of consenting to sex, whether that age be 12, 13, or 14. Now, I would argue and ask, why do you think that kids and babies aren't able to consent to sex?
Did you just include babies in this?
Babies consent to sucking their thumb, to sleeping, to choosing the fire truck over the Hello Kitty during play. They are perfectly able to show approval right when they're born.
Are you a Poe?
If a baby is curious about a man's genitals and he comes over and plays with it, that is a sexual act. But that is completely fine and harmless. Why should there be a problem with that?
You doubled down. I honestly did not expect that. Okay, the whole argument that I made about informed consent and such, you know, the one where a person has to know exactly what they're getting into, that and the development argument applies infinitely more here. Just copy and paste that right here. But furthermore, if you need more evidence against this, they are babies that you are looking at. They have no idea what sex constitutes, none at all. Holy fuck. A good chunk of animals immediately after birth have free autonomy, pretty much. All they need is that gestation period, and then they get popped out, and they're off. They can walk on their own, they can get their own food. Some animal parents don't even stick around. They just up and leave. Human babies are useless on their own. They have less than 30% that of the adult-sized brain at birth, and that means that they're deficient in a lot of ways, comparatively speaking. From birth to about 6 years of age, children are still developing, voluntary movements. And what does that mean? Well, it means that at certain times in an infant's development, they have ingrained reflexes. A few examples of these are rooting, when you put something against a baby's cheek and they turn their head to suck on something. It's instinctual. It's meant to aid in the process of feeding. The sucking reflex, when something touches the roof of a baby's mouth, they will suck on it. Again, this is to help with feeding. This is why there are so many babies who suck their thumbs, or some babies who use a pipa. And then there's the grasping reflex, which is when something essentially strokes against a baby's palm. They react by closing their fist around that thing. They're still developing reasoning and perception. Babies, they don't have a concept of object permanence until about 5 months of age, so literally, if an infant doesn't see something, it does not exist to them. Then from roughly the ages of 2 to 7, children usually still engage in a process known as animism, where they literally think that inanimate objects are alive and can interact with them. They're developing emotions, attachments to people, planning skills, and in the middle of all that crucial development, you are completely okay if some sick guy with a prepubescent child baby fetish wants to come into the mix, simply on the basis of social justice. I don't think so, Amos.
So I disagree that babies and kids aren't able to consent to sex. But even if I give it to you that, okay, all children below the age of 12 aren't able to consent to sex, does that mean that we should just reduce the age of consent to 12 and not eliminate age of consent laws entirely? No! You see, and this is where the pretty nuanced thinking comes in, so brace your brains. There is a clear distinction between a person who is able to consent and the ability to be allowed to engage in consensual acts.
See, Amos, you say nuance, but you've entirely done away with it. This isn't a simple matter of consent versus non-consent. It's a matter of authority figure over a juvenile figure, not even a juvenile figure, an infant. Trust versus naivety, manipulation and grooming, knowledge versus ignorance. All of these things play a factor, and you've just reduced it to a simple yes versus no. That might work for two adults who are on the same intellectual playing field, developmentally and otherwise, but not for an infant who has no idea what the fuck is going on, and an adult who's supposed to be the responsible figure.
A child is not able to consent to sex below the age of 12, but say the impossibility happens and an 11-year-old consents to sex. Is that fine?
No, it's not.
Absolutely. Furthermore, if an adult has non-consensual sex with a 11-year-old child, eliminating age of consent laws would not let the adult get away because there are already rape laws.
You seem to have completely ignored this little tidbit that is the manipulation aspect of all of this.
So there is absolutely no logical connection that eliminating age of consent laws would increase sexual violence, because there will still be rape laws to protect children from abuse. If you cite anecdotes of children who, at ages 9 or 10, had sex with an adult and then became traumatized their whole life, or predatory behavior where they were manipulated into a sexual act, those are incidents of child abuse and child rape. It is absolutely different from a consensual, harmless relationship between a pedophile and a child. What age of consent laws for sex do is simply restrict mutually beneficial sexual relationships between a child and an adult.
Amos, can you prove to me that in more than 100% of cases, child and adult relationships are mutually beneficial? Because even if only 1% of children were affected negatively, and I knew all of this, I would still have a problem with it.
Lowering the age of consent laws is not enough. If you lower the age of consent law to 10 and then a 9-year-old comes along and says, I have had sex with an adult and I was perfectly fine with it, do you think that that adult should go to prison? No.
I don't actually think you know what you're talking about at all, but that's besides the point. You lack a fundamental understanding of the cognitive and developmental processes of humans, and for that simple fact alone, your lack of understanding, you have put your argument at a great disadvantage.
It was perfectly harmless and both of them benefited. You think he should go to prison? That is insane. Look, I'm not a pedophile. I don't have a sexual attraction to children. I do not possess child pornography. I do not even know how to find child pornography. What I am concerned about is society fucking over a group of people who have done absolutely nothing wrong and falsely accusing them of being child molesters and child rapists. It's so obvious to me to not discriminate against a group of people who are absolutely harmless, similar to how we should not discriminate against gay, transgender, or black people.
But you see, we don't discriminate against them. The law that establishes the age of consent and such, those stand for everybody, not just pedophiles. No one can have sex with people under that age. No one.
But just because it concerns pedophiles, a far more discriminated community than the LGBT community in our current society, I just think that my stance on this issue is just very ahead of its time.
Well, considering that the behavior you're advocating for is one engaged in lesser developed countries, the Middle East for one example, ancient Greece for another, methinks not. In fact, we seem to have been straying farther and farther away from such behaviors as time progresses in the West. We no longer have our daughters marrying the moment that they bleed. And sure, call me an ethnocentric bigot for that, but you know what? If taking a stand against normalizing pedophilia means that I am a bigot, then I'll wear that title proudly.
But I guess only time will tell. Many of you after watching this video would probably still disagree with me, in which case leave a comment down below or even make an entire video response if you want to.
Done.
Maybe in a future video I'll respond to all your counter arguments. I hope we can all have a nice civil debate on whether or not we should discriminate against pedophiles without accusing anyone of being a child rapist or a child molester.
That we can, Amos. That we can. Just show me exactly where it is in society that we systematically and explicitly take rights away from pedophiles exclusively and simply on the basis that they are pedophiles. And then we can have that discussion.